Abandoning a submarine seems like a terrible idea for several reasons. The first is that they cost an incredible amount of money, so abandoning them without salvaging or recycling the viable parts is a waste. The second is that submarine development is top secret, so leaving one lying around is like inviting your enemies to come and take a look. Nevertheless, submarine abandonment does occasionally happen, and here's the proof. Is it fair to call the HMAS Onslow abandoned? Maybe yes, maybe no. She's been floating at the Australian National Maritime Museum for more than 20 years after being decommissioned by the Royal Australian Navy in 1999, and she hasn't spent many of those years open to the public. The Onslow is an Oberon-class submarine, one of only 6 in her class. She was named for the town of Onslow in Western Australia and was laid down in Scotland in 1967. Although the Onslow never saw action in a battle at sea, she was involved in a bizarre incident in 1972, when a disgruntled sailor pushed her to twice her safe operating depth as a form of protest against his orders. Somehow, the submarine and her crew survived the incident unharmed. She was the first conventionally powered submarine in the world to be fitted with anti-ship missiles in 1980, and proved her capabilities by sinking a 7-ship flotilla during a War Games exercise that year. But those days are long behind her. Having said that, though, she's in excellent condition for her age. She could probably serve again if it were required of her. The HMS Salin is one of just 3 Submarine-class submarines built by the Royal Danish Navy. Rather than being intended as long-distance vessels, the Submarine class was envisioned as a coastal submarine capable of defending shipping routes and harbors. Although she finished her career under the Danish flag, that isn't how she started it. The HMS Salin was laid down in Germany in 1965, after being ordered by the Royal Norwegian Navy. For the first 25 years of her life, she was called the HMS Otis. She was thought to be close to the end of her useful life when the Danish Navy purchased her in 1990, at which point she gained the Salin name. Almost immediately, it looked like the Danes had made a bad purchase. She sank in the Kattegat of Vesico while being towed to Aarhus in December 1990, and had to be raised by a German floating crane. It took 3 years for her to be recommissioned, but she went on to serve in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. She was eventually decommissioned in 2004 and became property of the Royal Danish Naval Museum. Just before the outbreak of the Second World War, 2 Kalev-class mine-laying submarines were built for the then neutral state of Estonia. One of them was the EML Lembit, which is now officially designated as a museum ship and can be found in the Estonian capital of Tallinn. The story of the EML Lembit begins in Barrow-in-Furness, England, where she was launched in 1936. She served first in the Estonian Navy, and then later in the Soviet Navy, having been commissioned into the latter after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. By the end of the war, she was known as the Immortal Submarine for her ability to take fire and yet remain afloat. This was an appropriate choice of nickname, as she was still in service until May 2011. By that point, she was the oldest known active submarine in the world, having survived for 70 years longer than her sister ship, the Kalev. She's also the only surviving pre-war Estonian Navy vessel. She's a record-breaking submarine, and so if any old sub ever deserved to be turned into a floating museum, it's the Lembit. We don't feel bad about including museum submarines in our list of abandoned submarines. If we didn't do that, we wouldn't be able to bring you fantastic old boats like the Finnish submarine Vesico. This is a vessel with a somewhat shady past. Built in 1933 in Turku under the registration CV-707, it became the prototype for the Type II German U-boat, a vessel that would do enormous damage to Allied forces during the Second World War. Between 1933 and 1936, She was on loan to the German Navy, but the Finnish took her back and officially named her Vesico at the end of that year. Finland was banned from owning submarines by the post-war Paris peace treaties, so she was decommissioned and eventually became derelict. That's how she stayed for more than 20 years until she was located and purchased by a group of former crew members, who restored her and opened her as a museum ship in 1973. You'll find her permanently stationed on the Finnish island of Suomenlinna, where she's officially considered an extension of the Finnish National Military Museum. Aside from that honor, she's also thought to be the only remaining Type II submarine in the world. Back in her glory days, the French submarine Le Rutabla, also known as S611, was the lead boat of her class. When it came to ballistic missile submarines in the French Marine Nationale, she was number one. Rutabla was commissioned at the end of 1971 as the first ever French nuclear submarine, but she wasn't instantly fitted with nuclear missiles. Instead, she carried 16 M1 MSBS ballistic missiles, each capable of doing enormous amounts of damage. She was refitted with nuclear arms in 1974. Fortunately, she was never required to launch a nuke, and so she spent the next 20 years performing routine operations and patrols. She's thought to have done more than 50 patrols of 70 days each, covering a distance equivalent to traveling around the world 32 times. She was decommissioned in 1991 after a largely uneventful military career, but wasn't removed from the water for 9 years. A team then spent 2 years removing the sub's nuclear reactor, making her safe, and then turning her into a museum exhibit. She's thought to be the world's only complete ballistic missile submarine hull that's open to the public. Here's another French submarine for you, albeit one that isn't quite as pretty as the Rutabla. It's the Alos, and she's a far older vessel than the one we just looked at. In fact, she's well over 100 years old. The Alos was built in Toulon Naval Shipyard and launched in October 1904. She's a Naiad-class submarine and was designed for the purposes of the French Navy. Given her age and purpose, you'd naturally expect her to have served in the First World War, but that isn't the case. Through little fault of her own, the Alos developed a reputation as an unlucky boat. A steamer called Muette ran into her in Toulon roads in November 1906, causing extensive damage. 4 years later, she somehow managed to collide with her sister ship, the Bonite, damaging both vessels in the process. Another accident in May 1914 left her stricken, after which the French Navy decided she was only good for target practice and fired at her until she sank off the coast of Fréjus in March 1918. The wreck of the Alos was rediscovered by divers in 1975, after which she was raised in 1976. She now stands as a curiosity outside the offices of Comex in Marseille. We're going back in time even further for our next submarine. It's the Tauker, which translates out of its native German as fire diver. The submersible vessel was designed by the famous Bavarian inventor Wilhelm Bauer, who went to the engineering team of Schwefel and Haupt to turn his vision into a reality. The Tauker was built just in time to be part of Schleswig-Holstein's flotilla for the Reichsflotte in 1850. Amazingly, the Tauker is still with us today, which comfortably makes it the oldest surviving submarine in the world. Despite that, it's spent several decades of its existence as a shipwreck. The purpose of Tauker was to end the ongoing Danish naval blockade of Germany. Unfortunately, budget restrictions meant that changes had to be made to the design of the submarine, including a change in maximum dive depth from 120 feet to just 30 feet. Unsurprisingly, this led to the Tauker sinking in February 1851 after equipment failure. It ended up at the bottom of Kiel Harbor, after which the wreck wasn't rediscovered until 1887. It's now on display at the German Armed Forces Museum of Military History in Dresden. The German vessel SMU-1 has a very important place in world history. It was the very first U-boat that the German Empire ever built. Only one vessel of the SMU-1's class was built. The boat was commissioned in December 1906, but was already considered obsolete by the time the First World War broke out. She was used for training exercises both during and after the war, but was struck by another vessel while on such an exercise in February 1919, after which she sank. SMU-1 was actually a redesigned Carp-class submarine, with modifications including a redesigned forecastle, larger diameter, a stronger pressure hull, and a heavier ballast keel. The most important change was the introduction of kerosene engines as opposed to gasoline, which had led to fatal fires and accidents on many other early submarines. She may never have seen active conflict, but she demonstrated the viability of the upgrades and became the template from which the first generation of U-boats was born. She was eventually salvaged after her 1919 accident and is now on display at the Deutsches Museum in Munich. German submarine U-995 was one of the last large submarines the Nazis ever built. The Type 41 U-boat was part of the Nazi Kriegsmarine, launched in July 1943 and formally commissioned in September of that year. Little more than 18 months later, she was surrendered to the Allies after Germany lost the war. U-995 was a powerful beast of a submarine, 220 feet long and 15 feet wide, weighing 759 tons and capable of exceeding 20 miles per hour across the surface. There was room aboard for 56 people, all of whom were collectively responsible for maintaining the boat and her weapons. Records from wartime indicate that she sank 3 Allied merchant ships, 1 warship, an auxiliary warship, and also accidentally sank a merchant ship of her own side before being abandoned after Germany surrendered. She was found stricken at Trondheim, Norway on 8 May 1945, the day after the surrender was confirmed. Although she was initially given to the British Navy gifted her to Norway in October 1948. The Norwegian Navy named her Kaura, and she remained in service with her new country until 1965. The German Navy League then took ownership of her and turned her into a museum ship at Labo Naval Memorial. We've already mentioned Wilhelm Bauer, who designed the Tauker. Our next submarine wasn't built by him, but was inspired by him. It's also named after him. The German submarine Wilhelm Bauer also goes by the name U-2540. It's yet another German U-boat, this time a Type 21 U-boat. She was finished and launched very close to the end of the Second World War, and after the German surrender was ordered to be scuttled without ever having been on patrol. A few years later, in 1957, someone realized what a stupid idea that had been, and so she was raised from the seabed near Flensburg Firth, refurbished, and recommissioned by West Germany's Bundesmarine 3 years later in 1960. She served for over 20 years before retiring in 1983. She's still afloat as a museum ship today, and as such, she's the only floating Type 21 U-boat in the world. As part and parcel of being a museum ship, she's been reverted back to her original wartime configuration, so visitors to the German Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven can get a taste of what life was like aboard a U-boat for German Navy officers. The Second World War was a boom period for submarine building in Europe, but the vessels continued to be built long after the war came to an end. The HMS Otis was one of them. This is a British Royal Navy Oberon-class submarine and was launched in 1962, spending her first year of operations passing a series of sea trials before being formally commissioned in October 1963. She was fortunate enough to avoid armed conflict for the majority of her career, instead spending most of her life working on missile trials in the Atlantic Ocean. Thought was being given to retiring her in 1991, but then the Gulf War broke out and the HMS Otis was sent to the Persian Gulf, where she was involved in deploying and recovering special boat service and special air service personnel. She's thought to have been decommissioned as soon as the war ended. Things looked bleak for a while after that as she sat at a scrapyard in Portsmouth waiting to be dismantled, but she was bought by a German businessman who turned her into a museum ship in his hometown of Sassnitz. She's still there today. We've seen a lot of submarines turned into museums over the course of this video, so before we go, it only seems right to look at the largest museum submarine in the world. That's Maritime Museum Peenemünde U-461, which was once known simply as Soviet Submarine U-461. She's a Juliet-class submarine, and how she came to be in Germany is unknown. Sources all agree that she legally became German property after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, but nobody can say by what means. Whatever the backstory may or may not be, the U-461 is enormous and has been left largely untouched from the day the Germans took ownership of her. Visitors aren't provided with any notes or guidance, and are instead encouraged to explore every nook and cranny of the boat themselves to see what they find. Submarines in the Juliet class remained in service through the tensest years of the Cold War before being withdrawn at some point in the late 1980s. There would have been thousands of Soviet officers in top-secret locations around the world living in conditions like this for months on end. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching and see you soon!